So welcome everyone to the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I'm Mariana Mazzucato, the director, and this is happening actually, I don't know if you know this, Simon, during the 10 days that we're celebrating IPP's kind of big thinking around technology, precisely a lot of the issues you bring up in this wonderful book that we're talking about today, Power in Progress, which is how can we actually make sure that all this amazing collective intelligence which has been behind innovation is actually good for people and planet, both in terms perhaps of how it's happening, but especially how the benefits get redistributed. And Reiner's going to introduce our panelists formally, but I just wanted to welcome you because the reason we actually set up the Institute was precisely to both ask provocative questions that are very much in this book, but also bring new answers that also involve debunking some of the underlying economic theory. So I would love it if in the discussion today, especially with our PhDs in the audience, I'm looking at some specifically, that we can go beyond the usual, which is to look at the role of technology in economic growth and ask issues around distribution, but also ask what are the underlying assumptions that different theorists, including ourselves, Simon, his own co-author, Darren Acemoglu, are bringing to the table when we're looking at the relationship between technology and economic growth. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Reiner to introduce our panel and to moderate.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for this introduction. And yes, thank you everybody for joining us here in this room. Also people online, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Reiner Kattel. I'm Deputy Director here and Professor at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And yes, we are very happy to have today here a distinguished panel. Some of them here, some of them online. I'll do a very quick introduction to the panel, and then I'll walk you through how this 90 minutes will look like. So instead of having a big book presentation, we thought we'll have a discussion actually, and exactly in this way that Mariana mentioned, because I think a lot of people on the panel, but also in the room here and online, are working exactly in these issues of how do we direct technology and innovation towards common good, or a public good or public value, or however we want to talk about it. So I think it's a sign of times, I think, that a lot of people are working on that topic. And of course, the entire institution that we are in, Institute for Public Purpose and Innovation, of course, was set up for that reason, actually. So I think it's a very appropriate place to discuss the topic. The book itself is very fascinating read. I mean, it's in many ways a historical book. It's a book full of stories and anecdotes and history. It reinterprets really a lot of the English industrial history, maybe. So you'll find really interesting nuggets about churches and all kinds of infrastructure and whatnot. So it's a really fun book to read as well. Can highly recommend. So the panel today is we have one of the authors, Simon Chonchens, is with us here today. He is a professor of entrepreneurship, I believe, at MIT. And of course, author of many highly acclaimed books about financial crisis, about America, about all these kind of issues. So like, for instance, the 13 Bankers that became one of the defining books about the financial crisis, for instance. And of course, Simon is also working in our sister organization, which is funded by Hewlett Foundation, as are we, partially at least. And this is a network of organizations really globally working on these actually very similar issues around technology and innovation for a wider good. So we are very happy to welcome you here at IIPP. And then we have Cecilia Rikap. I hope I pronounced her name correctly. She is a fellow Londoner. She works at the City University as an associate professor, and her main area of specialization, correct me if I'm wrong, is around digital capitalism. She has written a fantastic book on the topic. So after you're done with Simon's book, over the weekend you can read Cecilia's book, and I highly recommend it as well. And then online we have Julius Mugwagwa, our fellow journeyman from UCL. Is from a sister institution here. It's in the engineering department, actually. And Julius is specializing health and biotechnology innovations, and is a really fascinating researcher focusing on Africa and developing country issues in terms of catching up in technology. So this is our panelist, and first we have Simon talking about the book, briefly, without slides, off the cuff. And then we have Julius and Cecilia giving their reactions, myself as well, if there is no discussion from the audience. But hopefully we have a lot of questions online. There is Nai is managing the questions there. And then I'm sure there will be many questions in the room. So much for the introduction.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's a great pleasure to be here. My first time visiting your institute, but your influence has been felt in many places, including at MIT. And my previous book, Jumpstarting America, was very much inspired by your work, including your specific work, Mariana, looking at ways to increase the amount of spending on science and technology, create more good jobs, spread that around the United States. There is apparently a Jumpstarting Britain faction that's been developed. We can talk about that separately. And I think of that as being, we were more about let's do more, and let's do more that at least directionally is heading the right way, and from a public sector initiative perspective. And that became, many of our ideas found their way into legislation of the Chips and Science Act of last year, and so we can talk about that. They're still trying to implement that. Lots of interesting questions around that. I think this book, Mariana, to your point, is saying, okay, in addition to whatever public sector initiatives we might believe are underway, there are waves of private sector innovation and new technology that emerge. We did, I will say, expect that AI would be a good, when we started writing this book a couple of years ago, we thought that artificial intelligence would be a good topic for 2023. We had no idea quite how good it would be. So that tells you something interesting. And I think what fascinates us here is exactly as you said, Mariano, are there ways to, well, first of all, understand what's coming at us, right? Is this equalizing or unequalizing, and for whom, or from what perspective? Are there ways to direct technology? Right? I think that is sort of, we'll come on to that, and that's the bottom line question. Maybe we can perceive which way the technology is developing, we can update, we can talk about reasonable metrics and so on. There's a huge amount of questions, but maybe we can figure that out. But I think the big policy question is, what would you recommend in terms of moving the direction, and then we can decide what direction you want to move it in, but towards more good jobs, more equalizing, more opportunities for people with less skill, people who haven't done so well recently. I'll come on to that. So the three main points from the book, right? We'll see. For me, we'll see what Julius and Cecilia took away. But three main points are about vision, about bandwagon effects, and about automation. So the point about vision is that in our take on the 1,000 years, which way we go with technology, what we choose to invent is all about the people who are involved. Who has power, who has social power, who has status, what are they trying to achieve, what do they think is important? And we go through various instances of this, and we talk about plenty of examples of for example, why did the southern part of the United States develop and adopt and apply the cotton gin, which enabled them to move enslaved people or encourage them to move enslaved people from the East Coast to cultivate upland cotton across the Deep South. An absolutely terrible, horrendous humanitarian impact with long-lasting implications for human capital and for institutions across the United States. That was in one particular setting and a particular set of high-status people. In the northern part of the United States, of course, it played out quite differently. The technologies of the early 19th century were those that people have summarized by calling it the American system of manufacturers that would actually made low-skilled workers highly productive, in part because there weren't a lot of skilled artisans available. So these are different institutional settings, but you can identify the individuals. In fact, some of the same people were involved on both sides of that, depending on where they were situated geographically and socially at that particular point in time. So vision, and where do these visions come from, and who has the vision to shape AI? I think those are the questions that we're asking, and we want you to ask. And by the way, this is always the best part of writing a book, is giving book talks, but not me telling you what's in the book because you should just read the book, but getting your thoughts and reactions to these ideas. That's the really interesting part. So the vision question is, who's in charge of AI? Where is that vision coming from? Microsoft and Google are dominating it. What do you think they want to give you? Is that really what you want? What are the alternatives in terms of how we shape that? I should also say that my colleague, Dron Esamoglu, couldn't be with us this week. He was in London last week. He's pretty widely known among economists, quite widely cited. He gave a big lecture at the American Economic Association in January on some of these topics on technology and the direction of technology. And I read his lecture in draft, and I said, it's a great lecture, Dron, really terrific. But why haven't you mentioned vision? It's chapter 3 of the book. It's the central idea. He said, Simon, the economists are not yet ready for this. So I'm sure you're not like that. I'm sure you're totally open to the discussion. Yeah, right. Okay, so we're trying to put vision on the table, in the middle of the table. The second point is about what we call the bandwagon effect. So bandwagon effect is our term, but it's for this, the statement that you hear all the time, including from people in the tech sector. I was in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, Stanford, and I was in Seattle last week. And there were some good discussions. I'm not saying people there are all closed-minded, but the prevailing view is, look, you have a new technology. It's going to raise productivity. That will become higher wages, better health, more opportunity, and everyone will gain, eventually. And the word we'd like you to focus on, and again, there's 1,000 years of history to back this up, is eventually, right? So our take on the Industrial Revolution, and there's some, reasonable discussion with experts on this, but our take is that the Industrial Revolution, you could start it in the 1720s with a silk mill outside Derby. In the 1840s, we know for a fact that small children were pushing carts full of coal through deep underground mines with their heads. Right? This is established by the Royal Commission. This is the basis for legislation that was passed. Of course, the owners of the coal mines said it would be the end of civilization if you regulated labor in that way. It is also, I think, incontrovertible that from sometime in the middle of the 19th century, wages did improve, living standards improved. There was a big sanitation movement that we can talk about. There was a fantastic application of technology in a sensible way, and a really reshaping of cities. So they became at least as healthy as rural areas. They certainly didn't become. They would certainly stop being the death traps that they were previously. So, from the 1720s to sometime after 1850, that's a big eventually. If I said to you, congratulations, AI is coming, it's generative AI, they're taking over a lot of the cognitive tasks that you thought that you would have, your parents thought you would have it, that's why you got the education. AI's got this now, you're going to have to do something else. But don't worry, you're going to gain eventually. It's 120 years. Yes, that's a little disappointing, isn't it? I visited a leading newspaper in London this morning. I had a very nice chat with the senior editor, and on the way out of the building, we got into the elevator, and in the elevator was me, the very senior editor, whose name is known to you all. You probably read him every day, and a chap who was moving chairs, a lot of chairs on a little pulley. And I said, these are the two jobs you're going to have at this newspaper, for sure, in the future. The senior editor who has the wisdom to bring knowledge to you and share opinions, and the chap moving chairs. Because those are the two things the robots can't do. Everything in between is contested now. Everything in between, we can talk about, whether, sure, the technology's hyped. Sure, it can't do everything that it's today claimed, but it's also progressing much faster than even the enthusiasts were saying a year ago. So that's something we should take note of and think about, what do we do? How do we adjust to that? How much time does it take? And that leads me on to my third point. So the bandwagon effect is very weak in general. We got it in the 19th century. We did it in part because labor got organized. People wanted a broadening of political rights. I think the Chartists get a big hat tip on starting that process. But labor and organized labor is a very important part of that process. And countervailing power was strong enough to ensure that higher productivity mapped into higher wages eventually. But we've lost a lot of those countervailing powers in the United States, and I think also in other countries. And without the countervailing powers, what is going to turn or convert productivity gains into wage gains? We might talk about regulation. It's a very good topic. I've done a lot of work on regulation. Rainer mentioned my work on financial regulation. It's very hard to regulate tech companies and technology for reasons we can talk about. But I'll tell you, anytime you bring this up in the US, in Washington, D.C., someone at the back of the room will say, China. And that ends the conversation, right? So you have to come up with some policies that are robust to those different perceptions and preconceptions. All right, third point is the last point is about automation. So automation absolutely is always about replacing workers. That's what it means. You have a machine that does something the workers previously did. And that is, and we argue there's a 1,000-year arc. It's not all one continuous process. I mean, there's some stops and some starts. But you can go back 1,000 years and you can see Western Europe emerging from the post-Roman Empire period. And you can see innovation and you can see automation. And for a long time, it didn't get converted into benefits of regular people. The key to all of these automation episodes, and whether or not, sort of when you look back historically and you have a distance, you say, yes, that went out, that played out well, or it didn't, is whether new tasks are created. So are we, when Henry Ford automated car production in the United States, he started from a place at the beginning of the 20th century where there were about 3,500 cars being made in the United States every year. They were handmade cars. They were expensive cars. Not many people could afford them. By the end of the 1920s, the US was making more than 3 million cars a year. And it was employing 400,000 people in that industry. And the jobs were not just, Henry Ford brought in the assembly line, and then he brought electricity to the assembly line. Those were two big innovations, massively increased productivity, and replaced workers, artisans who'd been making cars before. But he also generated, he and the people around him, generated a huge number of tasks upstream and downstream, right? Now, Ford didn't do that because he was altruistic. He was paternalistic. He wanted to control his workers' lives. Fortunately, we didn't adopt that as a management practice. Do we think that seeking profit and being oriented towards just selling more cars, and the equivalent today, selling more software presumably, or however this generative AI is used, do we see sufficient new tasks being created? Because that's what keeps the demand for labor up, and preferably those tasks will be high productivity. Preferably there's ways for that higher productivity to be converted into higher wages. So all those linkages matter. But if you don't have the new tasks being created, that's a gap that you're going to have to worry about. And look, it's early days. I don't want to rush to judgment. We've got lots of detail in the book, and we try to be as fair as possible to what's happening within the industry, including the latest developments. And I think that the current focus of technology companies is excessively on replacing people. It's on developing what's commonly known as machine intelligence. The idea that let's make a computer that can beat a human at chess, and then we don't need a human to run the checkout kiosk in a grocery store because we've surpassed human capabilities. As opposed to the other tradition in computer science, which is also which is equally valid. It's not the predominant one today, but I think it's one we should spend some time thinking about and thinking about how we can encourage it. We call that machine usefulness. It's basically augmenting human talent in the way that a calculator augments your mathematical ability, in a way that some companies, but not that many, use AI to supplement and strengthen the ability of their employees to make good judgments. Much more common is using AI to replace your employees so you don't need them. So automation is coming. Countervailing powers are weak. The vision is dominated by a few people in Silicon Valley. These are all reasons to worry. But I don't think we should be passive about it. I think we should be very forward-leaning, and I think thinking about what the state and what either entrepreneurial states or not very entrepreneurial states can do is not just a valid question. I think it's the question of the day. Mr. Sunak says he wants to be the UK to be an AI hub, right? What does that mean? How would you actually deliver that? And what kind of jobs are you going to get if that vision is the Silicon Valley vision, as opposed to a vision in which you're using AI to make people more productive, more useful, strengthen their capabilities? I think that's the margin in which we need to press. Don't have all the answers. I don't even have all the questions. I have a lot of the questions, and I'm happy to stop here and talk to Julius and Cecilia and get their input. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can give a round of applause. And yes, I think, as you said in the beginning, I think one of the main questions I have, and you don't have to answer it right away, is what's left of actually the mainstream economic theory and policy after we read your book, because a lot of the tools are probably not that useful. As you said, Taron had this experience of, you can't even mention vision in the economics conference. So I think, but we will come to that, because a lot of the things you're talking about are really impossible almost to analyze or to use in mainstream economic frameworks, which is in itself really interesting. But I'll let Julius come first. You're online. And so, please.
Thank you, Rainer. Thank you. Yeah, got the book right here with me. Right. And thank you, Simon and Darren, for the very incisive thoughts that you share in the book, and also in your reflections that you've just made. It's a very engaging read on the economics of technological progress in history and what it means for the future. That comes through very clearly. And the problems that you articulate in the book, and even that you touched on right now, are written humanity all over them. And the solutions as well, they are written humanity all over them. And I think that's where the problem begins, because where do we go? But as someone that engages with questions of innovation and development coming from the life sciences, I found the remnants of positivism, techno-inevitability, and techno-utopianism in me being rattled by this book, because I was once upon a time a very strong or even fierce proponent of genetic modification technologies food security improvement in Southern Africa. And I actually saw regulations and institutions and public awareness agendas as impediments in the path of transformative progress or transformative technologies. So, and this is until my PhD journey actually transformed me from being a positivist to what I am now, a social constructionist and sometimes a post-structuralist, because I had to engage with the other side for me to realize that there are alternative pathways which do not have, as you mentioned in the book, a decided bias. I found that concept to be very, very fascinating, the concept of decided bias in favor of elites. But I think what that mentions actually is that there are a lot of actors, individual or institutional actors, that are probably accomplices in whatever bias persists in the system, either through omission or through commission of what they do. So how do we actually bring accomplices like that onto the side of really being objective around the argument? So I've become a keen student of history ever since I had this metamorphosis from where I am to where I was to where I am now. And then I've got enduring interest in the development and governance implications of technologies and innovations, particularly asking the question, how did we get here in the first place? Which is the history question, and I think he articulated very well in a very audacious way, actually, looking at a 1,000-year history. So congratulations for doing that. And I also like the fact that the book, in addition to avoiding the productivity bandwagon, as you highlighted, also avoids polemic and denialist standpoints on what technologies can do, because I think you do acknowledge that technology has really done a lot and they will continue to do a lot. But you do point to the crucial aspects of the social shaping of technology, which are really key, highlighting, among others, that any form of shared prosperity that we have now has emerged not from any sort of preordination on the part of the technology or any sort of destiny for the technology, but any shared prosperity has emerged from when the direction of technological advances was pushed away from arrangements that were serving a few, the narrow elite, like you highlight in the book, and that this is the way to go for artificial intelligence. And then I think I fully agree with that. And I also like towards the end where you say the book is not about preventing automation. So preventing automation is not the objective, but you suggest that what policymakers should do or should strive to do is to cultivate plurality of approaches that encourage greater focus on human empowering and human complementary technologies. I found that to be very interesting. And I think that would be comforting for humanity, because we are finding ourselves increasingly being very much threatened in an ecosystem with that comprises of humans and machines. So the human-machine ecosystem has been increasing over millennia, over decades, but we see that there's need to actually reflect on that some more. So I've got 3 reflections that I'm going to share. And I was actually just finding it interesting that you also had 3 points that you touched on: the vision, the bandwagon, and the automation. So I've got three reflections that I'm going to share, which actually stem from the notion of we. You highlighted that why are we not doing enough of what history teaches us? Why are we not doing enough of what history teaches us? So the whole notion of we is very interesting for me. Who is we? Who is us? Of course, we know that we can't do any othering here, but the apportionment of responsibility is really key. So one set of reflection that I have really is really about how what you capture in the book is really a question around responsibility and agency. I think those issues are really key. And I really am trying to understand who is we, like I said, and how do we, how do we begin to examine what progress is and what it is not, just the how part of it, especially when we reflect on this embedding of our understanding of what has happened and what is going to happen, when we embed it in interpretations and meaning making that make us a collective, when we know surely that we are not in this together. Maybe we are in it together, but we are sitting at different points in a very, very long continuum. So that's one question, one set of questions around responsibility and agency. Then the other question that I have, or the other reflection, is really around knowledge systems. I think this book is really capturing in a very big way that we've got a knowledge systems question here. And I like what you highlight in the book right at the beginning, where you define technology as collective human knowledge. Everything that we do to shape our surroundings and organize our production. I think that's on page 10, that it's really about the collective human knowledge. And you see that this immediately gets lost when we try to appropriate what's coming out of knowledge or what's coming out of technology, when we've got this corporate patronage of science by corporates, by the elites. So the whole issue that knowledge is actually collective, or the whole issue that technology is actually collective human knowledge, it gets lost in there. So I'm really trying to understand, and your reflections would really be key. How do we change the narrative? How do we begin to have the necessary amount of social pressure and even financial resources that actually bring back to that realization that knowledge is collective and we need to share the benefits equally as much as we share the risks as well. Then the third and final set of questions that I have here is that this book is really reflecting on issues around speed, accuracy, and inclusion. I think these issues are really key. And one of the things that I can quickly highlight is that the COVID-19 pandemic revealed to us that our institutions are not designed for speed, for accuracy, and for inclusion. Speed of decision-making, inclusion of people in different segments of society. I think that is something that is way ahead. And as we see already, the pace of automation, the pace of movement in different technologies, I mean, how much confidence do we have that we will be able to have institutions that are actually designed for speed, for accuracy, and for inclusion? So those are the three reflections I thought I could just make. Again, going back to the appreciation of the great work you have done and how audacious you were to do this and come up with a very coherent narrative. Let me hand back to you, Raina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julius, for your comments. And I think we will go directly to Cecilia. So then we gathered, then you can comment.
Sure. Okay, so first of all, let me say that I enjoyed a lot reading this book. I cannot recommend it enough. And when I enjoy a lot of book, it means that it's a book that sparks a lot of debate and critiques. So yes, so I will be a bit provocative, but it's just to entertain the audience, and also because honestly, I think that there is a lot that we can build on together on the basis of the debates that you put forward in the book. First of all, let me say that I think that the next time that Acemoglu has the chance to give such a speech, he should just speak about vision. So the other way around, he should put power discussions at the center of economics. That's what you do in this book. That's what the people working in this place do, and that's what a lot of us try to do. But at least in my case, I don't speak at the American Economic Association. So having that platform, I think that's the type of discussions that those people need, and we all collectively need. And you can see that this is a thick book. So there are a lot of things that one can say after reading it. So I decided to focus on 4 topics. One is the conceptual framework, and I will briefly ask questions and reflect on that. Then, because of the focus of my research, I will dig into capitalism, and in particular, as a third point, I will, if I have the time, mention a couple of questions, or perhaps I will ask you for some clarification about a couple of things in the way you analyze the 20th century and 21st century. And finally, I will make some reflections on the policy recommendations that you describe and you suggest in the last chapter of the book. So in terms of the conceptual framework, chapter 3 precisely discusses about power. and you use Michael Mann's theory of power, in particular his idea of ideological power. But you use the term power to persuade, and a first question, simple one perhaps, could be why power to persuade and not ideological power? But a more fundamental question here is that my understanding of Michael Mann's theory of social power is precisely that we can only understand power as the interplay of the four different sources of social power he discusses, so economic, political, military, and ideological, so the power to persuade. And of course, the book makes a lot of references to how those setting divisions have the economic power, the political power, and so on. But I was wondering whether there is something that you found when writing the book that led you to put the power to persuade at front page. Just to put it bluntly, there is one chapter about this, but no single chapter about the other dimensions. So this is something I wanted to discuss with you, and also in relation to power, but perhaps for a follow-up discussion. There is one part of the book, page 120, for instance, if I remember correctly, where you discuss about coercion and persuasion. And that reminded me a lot of Althusser. And so I was, again, wondering why not including different authors and putting them together and discuss about how different authors can contribute economists to better understand power relations and introduce them back to political economy discussions. So that in terms of the conceptual framework. And then moving to capitalism, I have 3 questions. One is a almost classical question these days, which is what's the concept of rents that you mobilize in the book? Because actually to me, and this is for instance in page 258, you use rent, at least I understood that you use rent as a synonymous to margins or profits. And in that case, to me, it means, again, please correct me if I'm wrong, that you are using the more mainstream economics way of thinking about rents as any profit that is above zero in the long run, because implicitly you're assuming perfectly competitive markets. And I would say that we actually need to distinguish between profit and rents, especially when we are discussing about digital technologies, technological change. So I just wanted to give you the chance to discuss a bit about the concept of rent that underpins the discussions in the book, and also in relation to profits and rents, precisely the discussion about who's capturing them. And I liked a lot the way you presented this discussion here today, but in the book, I missed a lot the companies, the corporations. There is a lot of discussion about elites, and I was wondering whether this is perhaps not enough, in the sense that, again, also one could build on Michael Mann, but we can also just read the Financial Times and say reality is super complex these days. There are many layers of complex interplays of power, not only in terms of economic power, but in terms of all these dimensions. And if one just thinks of elites, and let's say by discussing about these last decades, one thinks of those elites as the book says, as the tech tycoons. What's the role, for instance, of the other big corporations, of corporations in general, but also other big corporations, for instance, from the healthcare sector, and Julius probably can tell us a lot of things about them. What's the role of powerful states in that discussion? Can we just put all of them in this tag of elites? Elites, to me, refers directly to groups of people, but not to institutions, and not to the power that one institution, one organization can exercise on another. And that, to me, is crucial to understand the way technologies are being steered, directed. If you think about it, inside a global value chain and also inside a platform or different structures, you have a leading corporation that is determining to a great extent the type of technologies that other companies can adopt or not, or the way they will be adopting, what technologies are available for them and what are not. So again, I wanted to invite us all to reflect a bit more whether it's easier to start this type of debates but by distinguishing elite versus the rest, or whether we need more complex understandings. And as a third point in terms of just adding complexity to the analysis, when we speak of technology, one can distinguish between the producers and the users of the technology. And here, I think this is a crucial point. Because perhaps because of the focus on workers, which I think is a crucial aspect of the book, the book ends up being quite focused on the uses of technology. So how new technologies are being adopted by companies and what are the impacts, for instance, on workers, but also other impacts on the planet and so on. But at the same time, one needs to discuss about the process of producing the technology and how that is also being determined, what are the visions that underpin what technologies are produced and what technologies are not produced, how AI is produced, how it's not produced. So those were my three more general questions in relation to capitalism. And very briefly, let me just add two comments on two parts of your analysis of the 20th and 21st century. So in the 20th century, in the Trente Glorieuses, you mentioned the importance of unions and how an alternative vision was put forward and ended up to some extent pushing governments for the welfare state. But it surprised me that, and I checked, because I was quite surprised, so I double-checked, you never mentioned the existence of the Soviet Union. And one can also go back and say in Bismarck, that part of the roots of what afterwards ended up being the welfare state were already there, and part of what influenced Bismarck, one could say, was the threat of socialism as well. So, yeah, just wondering whether that was not discussed and to what extent that challenges the idea of the central role of the power of persuasion vis-a-vis the other forms of power. And then in relation to, there is something that I found super important in the book and very clearly explained, which is in the last decades, this vision that became mainstream where the idea is that what is good for the big companies is good for the US. Like going back to General Motors' motto and say, what's good for big companies is good for the US, and we can even think it in general. What is good for big companies is good for the world, for capitalism. And I would add to that also that we should simultaneously challenge the vision that we need big companies for innovation. And this is extremely important because this is also part of our more critical ways of thinking. It's in the late Schumpeter, for instance. And there are plenty of examples. The vaccines for COVID are examples that clearly show that what big companies ended up doing was limiting access to the vaccines and doing something that was not the creative research. And we have here Mariana and all her work showing that is, in many cases, it's the state that does this big job. So I think that just to complement the vision, that was kind of something that I found missing, on top of, indeed, this clear mindset of what's good for big business is good for the US. And to finish, in terms of the final chapter, I really like the fact that instead of just focusing on policies for science and technology, you opened up kind of a whole set, a diverse set of policies that also put the workers at the center stage, that emphasize the need of workers' organization, that emphasize the need of education. I think that understanding that these problems are all interrelated and to find solutions, we need to look beyond what's immediately in front of us. So it's not only a problem about how technology is produced or used, but it's a lot of other things, is super important. And in terms of the concrete policies, let me just disagree with three, and this is related deeply to part of the work that we've done with Lundvall in the book that Rainer was mentioning before. One refers to, and this is becoming like a kind of widely heard policy recommendation, break up big tech companies, and why I think that's not the solution. The first thing is that these companies tend to operate in markets that generate natural monopolies. So there is a risk of losing efficiencies that can certainly contribute to solving crucial problems. The second one is that in some cases, these companies are already formally broken up, regardless of the structures of multinational corporations and all the legal entities. If you think of Alibaba Group, Alibaba, the e-commerce part, is formally separated from the financial part. Nonetheless, and I even confirmed this with some interviews, they chat regularly, the people working in one company with the other, and chat like, do you have this data that I need for this type of analysis? So these type of interconnections are the ones that need to be broken. The fact that data is enclosed, the fact that AI algorithms are enclosed, and that only a few people from these companies have access to it. So it's not that much about breaking the companies at the market level, but about breaking their knowledge, or what I call as their intellectual monopolies. And then in relation precisely to that, there is one point on page 401 where we're moving forward, I'm almost finishing, where where you say that algorithms need to come from the private sector. And let me disagree, because first of all, a lot of the algorithms are developed at the open source software environment, and universities and public research organizations have been contributing massively to the production of new algorithms, to developing frontier AI. What happens is that then big tech companies end up brain draining that people, end up appropriating public research, but actually, already nowadays, those producing the technology are way more than those profiting from the technology. And this is also why I think, and this is my final point, that data ownership might not be the best solution. There is a technical problem first, which is that many data points speak about relations, and think of when you go and buy something at Amazon.com, who owns the data, the seller, the buyer. But also, and more fundamentally, that would push forward the idea that we need to keep on creating more intangible assets, privatizing access to knowledge, whereas we actually need data solidarity. But to have that, we need to first of all discuss what type of data we will be harvesting, for what, for whom, and that needs to be taking place in democratic environments. So let me end up by saying that a crucial message of this book goes precisely to what needs and what must be done and what is possible to do in terms of changing the choices that have been made in relation to technology, and emphasizing that technology is not neutral. And again, this is the right place to say that, but one needs to keep on pushing for this type of message. Technology is not neutral, and therefore the next question is, what is to be done to make the development of technology more democratic? And thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for your and Julius's comments. Thank you so much. And before I give floor back to Simon, I think Mariana, you want to have a quick.
I'm happy to come after he
Okay.
responds. I feel like there's so much on the table.
There is so much on the table. Yeah. The table is already falling apart.
Well, yes, if the rest of you would like to sneak out, Cecilia and I will keep out this till. Thank you both, Julius and Cecilia, for these very thoughtful and encouraging comments. I think Julius summarized the book, or provided his own summary in the book that was rather brilliant, and I will use some of your words without attribution, Julius, from now on. That's the greatest possible compliment. Yeah, I think that was all spot on and a very, very good sort of way to think about the knowledge systems and whether we have speed, accuracy, and inclusion in our institutions, and how to get it. I think those are very good questions. Cecilia asked some specific points, so let me try and at least briefly react. And I think you've read the book more closely than most people who reviewed it in the newspapers, Cecilia, so thank you for that also. On the persuasion point, I think partly this is shaped by my own experience working with finance and working with the too big to fail problem and other problems out of 2008, where there was enormous power, for want of a better word, that these banks had. And I shy away from referring to the companies. I like to refer to the people, because the people control the companies, right? So I'd rather talk about bankers or bank executives or the people who are making these decisions in the financial sector. I just find that kind of goes to the heart of it. But I take the point that there's what they control may matter, and what they control may have some attributes that outlast them as individuals, right? So I think that persuasion and just we like the Michael Mann framework a lot, but it just felt that in terms of the shaping of technology and why governments are persuaded to go in some directions on regulation, on finance, for example, and not in other directions, is a lot about, Jamie Dimon is on the front page of the Financial Press today saying things about the, geopolitical relationship between USA and China. Why, right? Why do people listen to Jamie Dimon, right? It's the social status. It's the political access. It's persuasion power that he has. Not as much as he would like, by the way, but he has a lot of it. We push back against that, and so that is I think our. It's not a revision at all of man. It's not even a twist on it, but it is an emphasis within that framework that we feel is particularly compelling. And why are Microsoft and Google so powerful now? And of course, Cecilia's absolutely right. And I hope this was clear enough in the book, that the technology, a lot of the technology was, and a lot of the invention came from universities, it came from public sector. A particular startup has been very influential, OpenAI. In fact, Anthropic, which came from OpenAI, is the Google sort of avenue into this technology. So the public sector has played a role, entrepreneurship has played a massive role. However, in order to train these models to the level that's provided these capabilities, it's required a huge amount of capital, right? So that's how big tech came in. In a sense, they bought their way in to a process that was already, the innovation was already either there or potentially there. So they acquired this intellectual power to which you refer. On mainstream economics, right now, this is also related to one point that Cecilia made. I think there's a lot of mainstream economics in the book, and I think we make good use of it. I do think we bump up against the limitations of it, and that's the point about vision, right? That is not something that sits well in or has been particularly understood. But hey, mainstream economists are great imperialists. I'm sure they'd love to take that over and embrace it. So let's have some competition around that. And so the idea of rents that we have is exactly supernormal profits. So profits not necessarily above zero, because we're not buying into perfect competition is where we naturally end up, but above the ordinary or expected rate of return on capital that you need to continue to attract capital into a sector. So supernormal profits of some kind, which are obviously fairly extraordinarily high in some of the tech companies that we've seen develop. And that's a big concern, that's what we're going to face, a situation where these people who've bought the monopoly positions will be harvesting massive economic rents of that kind. And so we like the word elites. I mean, we do talk about corporations. We talk about, for example, the change in corporate thinking and managerial thinking, and this is actually more than just a few people, the change in managerial thinking after the 1980s. And one version of events is people say, well, that's when we bought into, or the idea of shareholder capitalism became prevalent. I disagree with that, because I think we've had shareholder capitalism for a long time, just different ideas of what that meant. And when I read the leading voices of the 1920s, they are nowhere near as confrontational or as harsh about workers as people after 1980. But they were still looking out for the interests of their shareholders. It was a question of, did they see it as a zero-sum game, or did they think there was big win-win, and paying higher wages was part of how you made the company stable, and you made society stable, and the shareholders got to benefit. So I think that shift in ideology, and I think that was an ideology. Duran has quite a famous recent paper blaming business schools for this. Now, I work at a business school, and I blame economics departments. He works in an economics department. He says there's not enough data on economics departments to share the blame. So I'm inviting audiences around the world to go find the data on economics departments to match his data on business schools, and then we can resolve that question. There was a shift in thinking about what's the right way to run capitalism. And I would also say that, and if you've ever been to or if you haven't been to the Stanford campus, you should go to Stanford and you should find the Hoover Institution. It's not hard to find. They have a big tower in the middle of campus. This institute, this is a conservative think tank essentially within this university that has been focused since the 1930s on rehabilitating the good name of Herbert Hoover, who did not have a good name after the Great Depression. And they have had an 80-year campaign to push thinking and ideology in a certain direction around a lot of issues. But in this, it's pushing it towards the idea that, the business of business is making money, right? And the ideas that people associate with Milton Friedman. The Hoover Institution has been amazingly successful. It was organized, it was focused, it has spread those ideas consistently. I mean, the little effort that Mariana, Rainer, and I are involved in is attempting to rethink or push back against some of those notions about how you should run capitalist economy or market economy. But the Hoover centered effort has been going for almost a century now. On the issue of whether whether higher wages were paid because of the threat of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, by the way, is mentioned in the book, but in the context of collectivization and agriculture and the way they use agricultural technology. But you're right, that in the 30 glorious years, we did not emphasize that the threat of the Soviet Union taking over. Good point, and may well have been true for some countries. I don't think that was the issue in the United States. I don't think they were afraid that they didn't pay high wages because they thought the Soviet Union would take over or that their workers would become communists. That was never a threat in the US. So I think that we might be a little US-centric in that interpretation. I think there it was a genuine sort of idea of this is how capitalism is supposed to work, and also the trade unions were quite powerful enough in some sectors to say, look, we'll facilitate or not stand in the way of productivity increases, but we want more training for ourselves so we can have the jobs to operate the machines and the higher wages to go with that, right? And after 1980, they couldn't do that. After 1980, the unions were very weak. Yeah, I mean, and you know, do we need big companies? Is it in the interest of the big companies? Is their interest the same as the interest of the US or the interest of the world? I think absolutely not. And thank you for emphasizing that. There are other ways to organize this. So I think did I answer pretty much everything? Okay, thank you, Cecilia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now I think we'll open it up for the audience right away. I think, Mariana, you're very, very eager to ask questions. So but I think you need them.
Thank you. Yeah, so I actually haven't read the book, so I'm going to have to read it quickly. Yeah, Cecilia's notes, yeah. But given the discussion, I'm going to be even happier to read it. But I just did want to, I guess, a bit, well, to pry more into this issue of rents, because that is where actually economic theory differs. And if you look at, you just mentioned it, the business school's kind of concept of shareholder value, yes, shareholders have always been, for a long time, the 1920s as well, been seen as, you know, the main stakeholders, if you want, that have to be remunerated. But the maximization of shareholder value is much more recent. And that lack of reinvestment of the profits that come from what is, we've all talked about, a collective kind of, you know, investment program around technology stops then. And you really see it in the data. You see it on investment, literally, the I bit of GDP, you see it. And David Ricardo already, back in the 1820s, he had that famous chapter on machinery where he actually asked many of these questions, right? Like, what's going to happen when all this technology replaces workers? Marx later asked that in terms of the so-called falling rate of profit. And what you actually see in the data is that as long as the profits were, in fact, reinvested, jobs actually ended up somewhere else. So forget the automation bit, but that value extraction versus value reinvestment really kind of stops in the 1980s. And I'm just wondering what, if anything, you say about that, because that is what then makes us think that the concept of elites is not enough. You need to look at the kind of structural issues behind corporate governance, the kind of things that even Katerina Pistor talks about in the Code of Capital, that this isn't about the elites, it's the law itself in how corporations are structured. And it's not surprising, actually, that the CHIPS Act, which you mentioned quickly, I think you did, or the IRA, that Gina Raimondo, who, by the way, we've been kind of advising in terms of how to construct a CHIPS Act that's not just a giveaway to semiconductor companies, ended up also embedding within the conditions this condition about not just using share buybacks, you know, for those companies, for the semiconductor companies that are going to benefit from a 400 billion or close to 400 billion public investment program. That would be the obvious, it's not rocket science, kind of condition that should be embedded, let alone pay workers a living wage, use green procurement, and so on. So anything you want to say on corporate governance beyond the elite side, and how, yeah, it's the business school, economics departments, you know, long-lasting debate, fine, but actually this is about what actually happened in the 1980s and how does it enter your idea of how do you share the rewards at the corporate governance level.
Thanks. Let's maybe, or you want to take it right away? Yeah.
Well, she's the boss, don't we? She gets one-on-one, and everyone else has to be pulled the question. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, and it's a very good foundational question. Look, in general, I'm a big believer, as you may know, in the idea that institutions matter, there's persistence, and so when we create institutions that are more extractive or more inclusive, they live with us for a long time. And I think that's true in terms of corporate governance. I'm not sure, and maybe we should talk separately about what would have been the specific change of corporate governance in the 1980s that changed the nature of. I do agree. Capitalism, the nature of capitalism changed, and I think we're agreeing that what manages.
Michael Jensen's maximization of shareholder value, the whole idea of risk-taking, the residual claim. claim it,
Yes.
so they justify this massive booty being taken by the shareholders
Okay.
because of a theory of risk.
So let me summarize that for the people remotely. So yes, so we do emphasize exactly. We do, by the way, talk about Ricardo's chapter on machinery. You'll like that part of the book, and we mentioned Marx in the same context you did. And Jensen is a big Friedman. I think is a big factor. We talk about the Jensen-Meckling add-on to the Friedman perspective, but we see that. And I'm not trying to make this into a semantic thing at all. I mean, if we could find some specific things, that'd be good, because then we could undo the specific things. But actually, I think it's a bit more insidious and harder to counteract, in the sense it was an ideological shift. That instead of being that we can have I mean, even maximize or prioritize shareholder value while paying higher wages as productivity goes up, which I would say was the attitude prior to the Friedman-Jensen shift. What we argue, or at least argue in history, is it was an ideology. It was like, what are we supposed to do? And we link that, or Dron links that, and I'm not disagreeing, that business schools were the purveyors of that ideology, directly or indirectly, right? But that then was not about some rules of corporate governance, sort of work Katerina has done in other, Pistor has done in other contexts, like these rules are better, these rules are worse. I'm not sure I mean, yes, if you want to argue that we should have workers' councils and workers on the boards of directors, that's an interesting discussion. There are obviously some countries that do that. I don't think I would get very far in the United States with that one. And also, that's not what changed. It's not like we took workers. Workers didn't have a voice that they lost in corporate governance after the 80s. They did lose the union representation because and there's an interaction between technology impact and globalization impact there, right? So I think that we think it's ideology, and we think it needs to be countered at the ideological level. So proposing ideas like the state should do the kinds of things you think they should do, or the kind of things you think they should do, or the kind of things that we argued at John Gruber. That's all pushing back against the ideology that just let the companies do it, just let the big companies do it, and they can sort everything out. But yes, saying you can't use the money that we're going to give you for share buybacks. Very smart. Thank you for doing that. And it's kind of obvious and important, but it may not have been done without your intervention, because I'm sure the companies would not have suggested that restriction be put in the legislation, right?
Thank you. Do we have any further questions or comments? There's a lady in the back.
Hi, I'm Melanie Smallman. I'm in Science and Technology Studies here at UCL, and I am co-director of our fledgling Centre for Responsible Research and Innovation here. I'm going to put myself as a lamb in the room of economists. So I'm a sociologist of science and technology. I'm definitely not an economist. But I've got a sabbatical year coming up, and I'm just in the process of writing a book about how the inequalities driven by technology are shaping public attitudes to other technologies. And the bit of the book that's missing is the answer to the problem and what I'm going to propose, which is I've got a year to come up with it. And various paths are leading me, not least an article from The Economist relatively recently, leading me to explore the idea of, even further than what Mariana just suggested, is actually looking at alternative models of ownership. So The Economist has been arguing that workers need an equity stake in companies in order to, both in the companies that are developing the technologies and implementing them, in order to address some of these issues of equity. So I want to hear, is that completely nuts? Am I going to waste a year of my life exploring it? Is it a fruitful avenue to pursue? And if it is a waste of my time, what should I do next year?
Thank you so much. I think Jake next to you.
Hi, Jake Sumner. And Simon said that Ford created jobs sort of at either end, but if Ford could have substituted all the jobs for machines, would he have done that? And I think, is that not sort of a danger in the sort of AI future, and the terms of control of that and how that's taking place, and it's been alluded to a bit in the panel and what Mariana said on whether profits are reinvested. But I think, is there not an even bigger issue, and I think this is perhaps being missed in the AI debate and technologies, is that the data that's being drawn on, that AI is ultimately using from very early stages, is sort of all the works of human history, which is sort of slavery, gender bias, imperialism, inequality, all the rest of it, data is drawn from that as well, and all the biases, whether it be incarceration data, that obviously with the biases of policing judicial systems, and untruthful information from Russia Today to Trump social media and many other things. So it's driven by some of this information, and then so how do we actually get the information that's driving that to deliver what many people in this room, more progressive social outcomes, and what does that control look like? Because I haven't heard any answers to date of what we actually do about this raft of information that's driving it, which is not based on great stuff.
So what was your name?
Jake Sumner.
Thanks. So let's do these 2 questions, and then we come. Do we have online audience questions? Or? Oh, you have. Okay, we can take one from. Do you have actually a question? Or okay, good.
So I'm John Thornhill from Financial Times. I'm a journalist, so I'll be stacking the chairs at the end of this meeting. So I was really wanting to pick up on Julius's point about institutions and the fact that they need to have speed, accuracy, and inclusion. And really, you mentioned the whole generative AI discussion, and there are 2 interpretations, I think, on that of what's going on, which are highly relevant to what kind of institutions are needed to tackle that issue. So on the one hand, you've got the argument that the big tech companies are going to dominate all this, that is a concentration of economic power. So Lina Khan has been writing in the Wall Street Journal that we need to break up these companies to address that problem. But I thought it was fascinating, this leaked Google memo, which was talking about the big tech companies have no moat. They're really worried about the open source models. And so the competition will be enormous against them. And so that would argue from a kind of public policy view that you don't want to kind of regulate, because regulation can stifle innovation, and that would be a problem for the open source movement. So that there are kind of competing demands, as it were, on regulation. Do you want to address the concentration of economic power? Do you want to address the safety issue with AI? What kind of institutions do you think we need? Are the existing ones good enough, or do we need to create new ones?
Thank you. So let's do these 3 questions at the moment, and then I'll also, Julius and Cecilia, if you have any comments or questions, we can do a bit of a panel recoup as well.
Yes. So first of all, to Melanie, yes. So workers owning equity is a good topic. It has been explored by a few people. Marty Weitzman wrote a big book on this in the 1980s that you might want to go back to. I think, and of course, in Silicon Valley, a lot of workers do get equity participation in these companies. So I'm not sure even. We never got the full proposal that Marty Weitzman wanted, so you could think about whether that would make a difference. But the versions we have seen don't seem to, and they increase participation of the workers in those particular companies. I'm not sure that they're addressing, Melanie, the broader issues that we're talking about here. But it is worth thinking about. Is there something about who the owners are? A lot of the owners, by the way, with shareholder capitalism, a lot of the owners are people who have pension assets, and they're people who have endowments. And to what extent should that? Why hasn't that shaped capitalism more than you might have expected? So that's a good question. To Jake's question, yes. So that's of course very very important, Jake. And we do talk quite a bit also in the book. We have a whole chapter on social media and how that went wrong, and your concerns about bad information or contaminated information, biased information, then giving you biased recommendations or outcomes from the software, I think is a huge problem. Our recommendation, so systems like GPT are designed currently to give you a supposedly authoritative answer. Inside the authoritative answer is the biases and the contamination. And probably, once the Russians have figured out how to do it better, a lot more disinformation, right? Okay, is this going to Moscow? Anyway. An alternative way to do it would be for instead of having a purported authoritative answer, to show you multiple potential answers from potential perspectives, and you could even choose which lenses you would like to bring to bear on a particular question, and then let the human use their judgment, or even better, a sort of Wikipedia model where I tell my students you can't use Wikipedia as the final answer to any question. But you can use it as a way to start the investigation process and go look at the links and then go look at the underlying sources and make up your own mind on that. So I think there are, in the vision, our vision conversation with people who work in these companies, and we do have such conversations, is why don't you let's lean towards systems that emphasize the need for human judgment, including where did this information come from, and am I comfortable with those sources, and lean against pretending that there is a single authoritative source. I think you're taking away human agency and you're hiding the biases. I mean, and on biases, by the way, I think the good news is we're all much more focused now on human biases because our attention has been brought to the biases in the algorithms. And I think we should be judging those alternative biases and saying, can we do better? You know, if you appear in front of a judge in the United States accused of certain crimes, you don't want to appear on a Monday after their team lost a football game on the Saturday. Apparently, that's a well-established result because they're biased, they're angry, they're against, right? So with humans are biased, algorithms are biased. What can we do that would remove those biases? I think that's going to be a huge field of investigation. So that's good. So yes, John, I think you gave a nice illustration of why we're not going to get regulation of this technology. I think it's a hard process to do. I mean, Lena Khan, the head of the FTC in the United States, might want to break things up. It would take 10 or 15 years for her to do that through any court process. And there are legitimate concerns about if you put on a lot of regulation, are you going to lose innovation? And the fear of the using the China card is a bit exaggerated and a bit of a political card, but it's not also completely crazy, right? There are plenty of other people who want to develop these large language models, and they have, and the pathway has been shown, at least in general terms. So in terms of regulation, I think or the government action specifically, there are three things that we think of, definitely worth advancing the discussion on. One is around data. So to what extent are they using data without permission? They're stealing data. The data they've used, some of these companies have used data from copyrighted images to generate synthetic images that are now. So there's pictures in the book that I use with permission, and there are some that I can use in the book, not on a website. I can use them on a website, but not on social media. And I pay a lot of money to get images, for example, for these things. It's a little bit annoying, but on the other hand, it's totally fair and open, and I could buy the images from other people, or I can get Wikimedia images, Creative Commons licenses. But next time somebody writes a book, you're not going to need to go to those people. Their business has been destroyed by plagiarism. Now, how is that allowed, right? And I think getting people with property rights and larger interests organized against that and fighting against that, including through legal means, and then building alliances of them with smaller people who have, like us, who have data and who don't want our data to be used without permission. I think one interesting conversation I thought we'd talk a little bit more about developing countries, which is a great conversation and still at a very early stage. But I have had a conversation with some countries where they said, how do we get what we want from the AI companies? And I think the answer is, you're not going to get anything that you want. You're going to get a lot of things you might not want on the current basis, but if you can offer enough data to them in return for, we will give you access to the data with safeguards about protecting identity and what you do with it. And in return, we want you to develop the following applications that we can actually use, and we want them for free, right? So they may get their hands on that data one way or another anyway, but trying to create a deal where you have some control over how your data is developed, and you can push the people who have the power to develop, not just the big companies, but this is the big companies we want to put pressure on in that direction. I think that's absolutely worthwhile. I think the second thing is surveillance. There's already a huge amount of surveillance in your society here and in ours in the United States and other places, and the technology exists. And we believe it's being used to assess worker performance and who you want to fire on the basis of how people move around the office. But what is the movement I'm doing with my left hand or my right hand that makes you want to fire me? They can't tell you. Right? It's a complete black box. And I think Shoshana Zuboff wrote a brilliant book about this and absolutely got ahead of all of us, and we're just standing on her shoulders here. But I think that is an issue on people on the left and from the left and the right in the US, for example, can agree on, which is let's have a lot of guardrails on surveillance. Yes, you can use surveillance for some agreed things, but not for other things. And if you're going to use surveillance as a employer management tool or a tool of worker suppression, let's be very clear about what exactly you're measuring. And if you can't explain it to us, that's going to be a problem because doesn't fit within standard labor law. in our respective countries anyway. The third thing we're proposing, John, which you might like, is Kim Klausing from UCLA Law School, former senior Treasury official, has proposed a graduated system of corporate tax. So if you make more profit in dollar terms, you would pay a higher tax rate in her system. And the point of that is, she proposed this before AI came along, but I think it fits perfectly here. So if you make mega profits, I would call them rents, you can call them something else, but you make mega profits because there is the monopoly thing. If that prediction is correct, that's what we think is going on, but as you say, there's other views. Okay, graduated corporate income tax, if you make the mega profits, you pay the higher tax, and then your shareholders are going to want you to break up, because then you pay a lower tax rate. But that's a conversation between management and shareholders. You sort it out, and and subject to Cecilia's point about no fakery, no pretending to break up and not really breaking up. That one we do actually have some legal tools against. But if you don't make the mega profits because it turns out to be highly decentralized, you're just going to pay the regular rate. So that it's purely an incentive to allow plurality and competition. The problem, of course, to anticipate your follow-up remark or question, John, is you need international cooperation on that. But we need that anyway. I mean, the corporate tax system is ridiculous, and we have a graduated system the other way right now. So it's an encouragement to become more of a monopoly and more global, because you can hide the profit. So I think making that central and emphasizing, and then let's see what happens to the profits, and let's see if they're taxed. I think that's going to be a pretty good conversation.
Thank you. So do we have Cecilia and Julius? Do you have any follow-up comments given the discussion? And yeah.
So on the China card, I want to follow up on that because I find there is it's not only someone at the back, but it's actually the CEOs of these companies. If you remember when they were called to the US Congress for the hearing on precisely big tech companies and their market power, they were always bringing this card, like the China card. If you regulate us, then the real threat will come, and that's China. And one important point to make about this is that when you look at the network of, this is a bit technical, but if you don't follow me, I can go back and say it slowly. If you go and look at the network of co-authoring organizations that are presenting the most in AI conferences, so which are the most important organizations presenting in the leading AI conferences, but who are they working with? You see Microsoft at the center of this network, but the center of this network is more than just a central place in a network. Microsoft is actually the node that connects the China clusters, so the clusters with universities and even big tech companies and other companies from China, with the Western clusters, full of universities, public research organizations, and companies from the West. So Microsoft has a narrative and and tries to persuade others of the China threat, but at the same time, it's a company that since the 1990s has been deeply anchored in China and is also using the knowledge developed in China for its own purposes. So this, geopolitically, I think is extremely important. And this is also why we need to identify the ways in which they set agendas and persuade, but we also need to identify what they're actually doing. And in relation to that, my other comment concerns open source software. Because Microsoft used to be the company that said that open source was a cancer, but then it ended up acquiring GitHub. And it ended up being one of the companies that promotes, apparently, at least it's what they say they do, they promote open source the most. And Google does the same thing, and Facebook as well. If you look at GitHub, the projects that have more contributors are from originally put in open source by these companies. But then when you dig into the way they manage knowledge and how they divide in pieces the algorithms, you see that what they put in open source are things that are actually just expanding their control and their power and making all the other developers more dependent. And the secret ingredient of the sauce is always kept secret. So this way of conquering other spaces, that before could have been seen as a threat, China, the open source software environment, is something to focus on when we think of regulation. So I think that we need to regulate what's going on in the open source software environment, how these companies are using it for its own purposes and profits. So there is a discussion there. And there is also a discussion about the regulation of the AI talent market. And it's instead of going against the companies, let's try to regulate what the people working for these companies are doing. And this is also why, if you want to speak about people, we shouldn't not only speak about the managers and CEOs, we should speak also about the AI scientists and engineers, the people that are coding, that are developing the ChatGPT and the like, that are working for these companies. So that needs to change. We cannot have the best trained people developing cutting edge technologies of our time for the profit of these companies. And for that, I think there is a lot of work to be done in terms of regulating that labor market. I don't know what you think about that.
Thank you so much. Julius, do you have any follow-up comments?
Yeah, thank you. Very fascinating discussions going on there. I just wanted to pick up on the point of which Cecilia is highlighting, and I think that has come through quite a lot as well, the issue about deconstructing the different actors, whether it's the elites or the corporates or any other actors within this ecosystem we are talking about, and how, I think for me that's really quite key, even when we talk about ownership, just deconstructing that and being able to identify within that any particular points of agency or any particular opportunities for changing the narrative, because I think that's really key. But I think the problem then begins when we realize that these actors, whether we've deconstructed them to whatever level, they exist within a context of structures and relationships. And then it doesn't end there. We have these relationships which are not static. They are continuously moving. I think in the book, Simon, you do highlight how the relationship, for example, between science and industry has changed. And we see that changing all the time. On page 140, you do mention that. And also very fundamentally that these relationships between the actors and the different players are not immune to the influence of power in its different forms, whether it's big P power, small p power, whatever power you're talking about. And also, I think, and this is where developing country settings will really come in, but this applies globally as well, that relationships are not necessarily a matter of choice. You may not choose to have a particular relationship. Being an actor, the kind of relationship you end up with, whether it's with the corporates or the elites, is not just a matter of choice. These are very normative and very political matters as well. So I think that really just complicates the conundrum. But I was just throwing in this for us to reflect on how it is important to deconstruct the actors and the different relationships that are there, but also recognize that even when we peel the layers around the relationships, we begin to see how they are very much in a state of flux. They're conditioned by politics and by some normative values. And that then conditions the kind of social movement that can emerge, which I think is one of the key recommendations of the book, that we need to see the emergence of social movements that actually push back on the direction of travel for technologies. But how do these social movements emerge in a context where relationships are shifting and where they are conditioned by so many other factors, which are sometimes beyond the control of the individuals and the other actors that are in there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think it speaks to the quality of the book that we have such a deepening conversation going on here, which is wonderful to see. But before I give the floor to you again, do we have a question online? And then I come to you, Zeynep, as well.
Thank you for tonight's discussion. So this question comes from Carlota Perez. So it begins with, from historical experience, many of the job skills and skills lost to technological change end up being replaced by the requirements of the changes in lifestyle. Of course, you have the problem of whether the wages of such jobs, which are often in services, will be decent or low wages. That is, of course, a social political issue. Wages are not determined by the technology, although obviously some skill-related differences in wages are inevitable. Green, sustainable lifestyles could create millions of jobs, which could be well paid, from healthcare to a rental and maintenance model that would make electrical appliances last 100 years. There are many jobs, some AI assisted, that could be created. Having not yet read the book, do you concentrate mainly on the job losses, or do you also look at the job creation possibilities?
Awesome, and I love the fact that Carlota is with us. So hello to you, Carlota. And it would have been one of my comments to bring actually Carlota's work into the discussion, because I think her work has been really foundational for many of us here in sort of understanding the long-term technological changes that take place. But I'll come back to that if there's time.
Yeah, so...
Oh, no, because we had 3 already, so we have three more.
Yeah. So on Carlotta's question, on point, which is a very, very good one, we do talk a lot about the possibilities of this technology, and we're not anti-technology people. I think it's a question of the direction of technological change. And wages are, I think, a fairly simple metric, and they are quite indicative of where the trouble has been in recent decades. But sure, if productivity increases and you can have some of those gains go to change in lifestyle, in addition to change in wages, absolutely, that could work for us, and I think that would be an attractive piece, and maybe that's a more sustainable piece as well. So on Julius's points, I think again I'm just in agreement that there's a lot of historical relationships that have come from been built over the past 500 years, including from colonialism, that remain with countries, and that is part of where you sit in the global economy, and part of why this technology is being given to these countries, or even they're having no alternative but to see their people adopt it, and trying to change that relationship and change some power and work together in the conversations with these tech companies, I think is important. I understand it's not easy, but I think we're in agreement there. On the I was trying to think, Cecilia, whether I should introduce you to my Republican friends or my Democratic friends, and I think both are going to like what you're saying here. So you should think about that. Well, the idea that Microsoft is at the center of a central node in a network with China at the same time, you can meet my Republican friends on that one. But the idea that they set up and have encouraged open source software and the use of these data repositories that are then they harvest in the training of their own models, I think that's a fascinating expropriation of property and people's creative efforts. Now, the idea that we're going to regulate labor and somehow, I mean, there are particular workers who in sensitive occupations, including nuclear scientists, who we do track, and we do have strong views about where they can work and in which country they can work. Are we ready to put people with a PhD or whatever qualification we think in artificial intelligence in that in that bucket? Well, I will ask my students at MIT next time I see them how they feel about this. I think what they will say is, good luck catching us. And I think we're some distance from being willing to, from seeing AI. I mean, we have discussions on the campus about how dangerous is AI relative to nuclear weapons. Right? And it's a serious discussion, and people take a variety of positions on that. And if it's the case, I don't think we're there yet, but if it's the case that people become convinced that allowing enough of this technology, which means ideas and what individuals can do programming-wise, enough of it to fall into the hands of terrorist organizations or non-state actors with evil intentions, if people become convinced that that is at the same level of risk as nuclear weapons technology falling into the hands of those people, then you would regulate what those people can do in various ways. I don't think that's not our view of the technology yet, and that's not the consensus, but we'll see what happens.
Very simple things. For instance, saying someone that a simple thing could be to say an academic that they cannot work at the same time for a university and for a big tech. And when you see what's going on, a lot of them don't want to lose the academic food, but still work for the company. And what ends up happening is that at the company, they have a non-disclosure agreement. So if they work for the company, then there shouldn't be a non-disclosure agreement because they are also public researchers. So, okay, they work for the company, they can say everything they hear in the company. Otherwise, they cannot work for a private company. So those small, even if it's a small thing, it can already contribute.
Yeah, so that specific suggestion I think is a good one. But I should also say I know some of my colleagues, particularly given where the sector or the technology is at this moment, are likely to leave MIT and go work for the company full time. Right? So then what are we supposed to do? What's the restriction that you want to put on them? And I think that's hard to reconcile with letting people use their own talents.
pay better salaries, give more space to academics, not only to AI people, to people that really want to engage and do meaningful research. If they are always tracked by the number of papers where they publish instead of giving time to really develop meaningful ideas. So we need to discuss about assessment criteria university, the funding that they get, of course. And I've been interviewing a lot of people from like leading AI researchers from these companies. They want to work in these companies because they don't need to apply for grants. They already have the processing power. They already have the data. But the US state, the UK state, the EU, can't they also provide those means for these researchers to do meaningful research for the people? I think we should at least try to push the state to do that.
You heard it here first. I hope that you can take this to government councils around the world. Great advice. Absolutely, fully agree.
Yes, I told you she wrote an excellent book on the topic, so you should go read. STEaPP, the next question. And from one of the leading AI institutions here in town. So, oh yeah, go ahead.
I am the director of Data for Policy Community Interest Company and editor of Data and Policy Journal. My question might be a little bit on the edge of the conversation, but I wanted to ask about what you think about the quality of the progress that we are making. Basically, I want to go back to your first sort of starting point where you were talking about the Industrial Revolution and how electricity, assembly line, blah, blah, made things eventually work for everyone. Well, we can obviously, we can say that we are all wearing better, well, more clothes, more standardized clothes. You can discuss the quality of it, but still it looks like it worked for the humanity in the eventually, basically. But what is currently happening is really automation of the intelligence, and that's quite a lot of the debate around data dependentness of this progress, and also the convenience of and the easiness of using these sort of technologies. We already have ChatGPT, and we already see people relying on it for quite a few tasks, despite the fact that we all know that there are lots of problems with it. But the convenience, the speed, the efficiency that it brings still convincing enough for people to take this on and provide services relying on that sort of technology. So that means in the longer term, basically, what we are going to end up is probably median quality, good, median service quality better with that sort of intelligence, but overall we are quite dependent on quite average, actually, quality that's suppressing the maybe good ideas and good progress. So that means eventually we are risking ourselves into a really less, I mean, intelligence, operating with intelligence that is less that has got less quality. So just, yes, any perspectives on that?
Thank you. I think we have the gentleman in the back there with the glasses.
Thank you.
No, it's just online.
Yeah. Thank you so much for an insightful discussion. I come from LSE. I am a Chevening scholar. I was invited here by Robert Wade. You really see on the stage the schism between an American perspective and a UK perspective or a European perspective. I wanted to ask you about the, I'm currently reading a book, Kicking Away the Ladder, which was written by Ha-Joon Chan. And I was wondering about the kicking away of the technological ladder that we see on the global stage. The United States and European countries are employing, I would say, a thinly disguised brute force against Chinese tech sector. Be it Huawei, be it TikTok, be it other companies. And my question is this: do you think that these attempts are actually weakening the soft power of the United States? That they are actually delegitimizing the United States as a global leader and are actually paving the way for a more multilateral global order? Thank you.
Thank you. And as the air and time is running out of this space, we have like 2 more questions. Gentleman over here. And then Mariana, you get the last question.
Hi, thanks, Simon. My name is Amir. Also, I haven't read the book yet, but so maybe you addressed this in your book. But my question was about your thoughts on what shapes the perceptions of progress through technological innovation. For example, one of the factors that led to that kind of ended the Islamic golden age was resistance to adoption of the printing machine. And today we see it with ChatGPT that you mentioned, where most academics react to it by thinking, how can we ban this, prevent students from using it or detect it? And perhaps a minority that thinks, well, let's try to encourage them, right? And adopt the correct marking in a way that, is based on them using this new tool. So what do you think distinguishes the kind of firms, civilizations, and powerful incumbents that actually use disruptive technologies to, what you called it not machine learning, but machine enhancement?
Yes. Machine intelligence, machine usefulness is our term. So useful to the humans, but yes, human augmentation. Other people use that term.
Yeah. So what distinguishes firms that go on this path versus those that actually use their incumbent position to actually just prevent or perceive progress as something that is just against the interest and therefore get left behind?
Great question. Mariana, you have the last.
Yeah, mine's not a question, it's just a comment. We have a project here in the Institute called Mapping Modern Algorithmic Rents, where we actually look at a lot of these issues, and we have kind of a debate between the Shoshana Zuboff view, which is, you think you're searching Google for free, but Google's searching you for free, and that's how it's been from the beginning, and it's kind of the bad, let's say, was there from the start, versus the Tim O'Reilly view, and Tim is actually part of our project, and we're actually quite indifferent to who's right, who's wrong, but we're trying to look at this historically and also test it, which is actually, that wasn't how it was in the beginning. There was profits being made from genuine search. And then once the internet, the market, basically saturated this idea of attention rents, that what you're actually seeing is not a genuine search, but things that are, Amazon products, Google products, this is just a subset of the issues, obviously, that we're talking about today, starts to happen. And I think that kind of phase change, when does it happen, why does it happen, what does it do to the rents or the supernormal profits, so on and so forth, is important because that's part of the history. But there's no one answer. Even these two super smart people, one person who was in the sector and another who's probably the best historian ever, as you mentioned, Shoshana, have very different views. So just to remind ourselves, there's no one, it's not that the data is going to tell us what the history reveals. It actually depends on all sorts of assumptions one is making when bringing, when looking at the history.
Yes, so maybe I might go in reverse order through these questions. So I think, I don't know the answer to that history. It's an interesting question, but I think we agree that today, or what developed, was a model based on attention and engagement. And I think part of the reason that matters for thinking about AI is those companies have an interest in presenting you with this supposedly authoritative answer, so you don't click away from their page to go look at other sources. Wikipedia leads you somewhere else. The ChatGPT model says, you're done, right? And I think that's, intellectually and cognitively and from a humanity point of view, that's a bad idea, right? But that's what the business model leads them to do, so maybe we have to change the business model, but that's hard to do. I think on the question about the link between the Islamic Golden Age, ChatGPT, and machine usefulness, I love that link. I think the view of what happened under Islam, and also the Chinese, who had their a couple of golden ages, it is an important point that in those prior civilizations that were not as they never developed industry, and I think that industry has changed a lot of things about basic attitudes, but and what it means to be an elite and what social mobility means. But there's certainly they ran up against resistance of the influential people, the people with social power, who didn't want the next generation, right? So why didn't they want it? Really good question. Presumably because they found it threatening in some form, as opposed to the agricultural elite of Britain, who were not the leaders of the Industrial Revolution, but sufficiently amenable to compromise and happy to back George Stephenson in his steam engines at the appropriate time and so on. So I don't think we're going to have a running out of, or an end of innovation, because I think we've gone beyond that. But that's certainly what happened to those previous civilizations. I think that why do you go with machine intelligence, machine usefulness versus machine usefulness? I think this is just it's an idea. It's what do you think technology is about? What do you want to invent? What do you believe is the right path? Those are just beliefs that people have. And I think you can go either way on this. There's no reason why a GPT has to, or generative AI has to try and pretend this is the definitive answer. And everybody should be aware, just in case you're not, that when it gives you an answer, you should say, show me the sources. And it may often say, oh, I was just kidding, or I don't know, right? So that's, yes? So, or make them up. Yes, well, that's true also. If they look plausible, then show me the link, I think is the answer to that one. So I think the book is trying to tackle what we think is a very big potential problem. The big idea is to let's reorient technology by thinking about it differently and changing the vision. I think, people like Rainer and John and Mariana are going to push to say, okay, but what does that really mean? What are the policies that you can actually propose? Because that's where we have a lot of sensible discussions in our countries. And so that's why we come up with those specific things. But really, at the core, we want to change how people think about what is technology, what do you want to do with technology, why are we inventing this, right? And is there some way to do it other than the mad pursuit of a little bit more short-term profit, right? What's the social interest? Because that's how we did get eventually great benefits from the Industrial Revolution, as Zina said. On the kicking away the ladder, I think this is a really important question and point. I think it's quite possible that developing countries are going to lose more of the ladder because you could think of this, or I think we have a subsection called the mother of all inappropriate technologies. So one of the problems many countries have had is that they receive technology that's developed in high-income, high-wage countries. They apply it in their economies, and that this contributes to having a relatively high productivity small part of a developing country and a lot of low productivity parts that don't develop, right? Or shadow economy. There are other issues, but that's the technology dimension. So one thing that strikes me about the ChatGPT moment is it was everywhere all at once already in November. And I already knew in December people who were firing workers in low-income countries who previously drafted marketing materials in not very good English that was then polished by a native speaker. You don't need people who don't write that kind of draft anymore because the machine can do that. So now, maybe those people go off and do other productive things, right? That's a key question. But it's a big shock to a lot of countries all at the same time, and we're struggling. We will struggle with this in the US. I think you grapple with it in the UK, and we're relatively much better positioned to adapt and come up with new things. And I think, Zina's asking the absolutely key question here, which is, let me restate it, make sure I've understood it, but at least I think we're on the same page, which is, if we, to the extent so there's a very good paper by Eric Brynjolfsson and some co-authors on customer service from a tech company, where they receive incoming inquiries from customers, and they're given advice from their in-house AI about what potential responses they could give. But the company says, and it seems to be true, that the goal is not to replace the human, it's to help the humans have the relevant information and then use their judgment. Okay, so the result they emphasize is that the productivity of the less experienced workers goes up because they can now draw on more experience more easily. And they're happier and the customer's happier. So that's good news. The result that's in the paper that they're not emphasizing as much, but we'll have to have a conversation about this, is that the productivity of the most experienced workers goes down. Right? So what's happening there, presumably, is there's an averaging out or reversion to the mean because you were given this great advice, you were the leader of the pack, and now you're either discouraged or you're like, you know what, it takes quite a bit of effort to think up what I should do, and I could just rely on this AI judgment. And then what is the company going to know going forward, right? What is the additional information they're going to have in the next version of this AI? It's going to be based on more average answers. So if you're discouraging the people who were having the really good ideas, then you're losing this edge that was giving you growth and creativity, and all the variability. The variability is being compressed, but it's being compressed. We've bringing up making lower income or lower skilled workers more productive is a good thing, particularly if you can then pay them a higher wage or they can have a better lifestyle, I would say. But the point should not be to discourage creativity, brand new ideas, doing things that humans have never done before. You need a microphone.
Sorry.
You can give her a microphone. This is very important.
Sorry, just didn't mean to interrupt. I was just thinking, I mean, we don't want that, but it happens because human psychology is drawn to in that direction, essentially. I mean, if you don't need to, if you don't have to, you don't necessarily think about something very much in detail, or I mean, if there's a good enough answer somewhere, then you may easily stop thinking about it.
Yes, potentially. So look, I sometimes people ask me, what kind of job should we get? What do we recommend to young people, given what's going on? I think there's two pathways. See what you think about this, Cecilia. One is go fully into AI, embrace it, understand it, become one of these people that Cecilia wants to regulate, and just be at the center of everything. The other is to find things that the AI is not good at, it can't do, and many of those things are pushing the frontiers of knowledge, including around science. And that, I think, is maybe AI can be a bit of a tool, like searching or making sure you know what compounds have been tested previously for what properties. But doing things that are not interpolating between what previous human activities or answers, but are genuinely new knowledge. I'm also, I should say, in a moment of advertising, going to Hay on Wye, the book festival on Sunday. Hay on Wye is important because it's the secondhand book capital of the world, and I'm particularly going to be buying books. I always take an empty bag there. I'm presenting my book, but I'm going to be buying books, particularly emphasizing books that have not been digitized. Because what's my edge? What can I write about? What can I know, right? The things that the machine has not got to. I'm also, by the way, opening for Dua Lipa at the Hay Book Festival. She's on the panel after me. I don't think she's talking about AI, but you might want to tune in for that. That was also free advertising. Yes.
On that note, thank you so much for coming. We are way over time. It's a sign of a good book, good debate. Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you so much, Cecilia. Julius online. Read Simon's work, Cecilia's work, Julius's work. You'll find them online. They're all online, I think. and yes, read. There's lots of interesting comments and questions. And I hope you use this discussion for creating new visions and convincing people to actually take technology more seriously than we do today. Thank you so much for coming, and have a good night.